The Old Testament presents a multifaceted and often perplexing moral landscape, with narratives that pose profound ethical challenges. These challenges stem from the cultural, historical, and theological contexts in which these texts were written, as well as the complex portrayals of human behavior and divine intervention. Many of these stories reflect the realities of ancient Near Eastern societies, where moral and legal systems differed significantly from contemporary ethical frameworks. Among the most intensely debated ethical concerns are divine commands that seem to sanction violence, the treatment of women and marginalized groups, and the interplay between divine justice and mercy. These issues continue to provoke discussion among scholars, theologians, and believers, as they seek to reconcile the ethical dimensions of these narratives with modern moral sensibilities. One of the most striking ethical dilemmas in the Old Testament is the apparent divine endorsement of violence, particularly in instances of warfare and judgment. Perhaps the most well-known example is the conquest of Canaan, where God commands the Israelites to annihilate entire populations, including men, women, and children. Joshua 6-11. Such passages raise difficult questions about the morality of war and divine justice. Some scholars argue that these accounts reflect an ancient worldview in which war was seen as a means of securing divine favor and national survival. Others contend that these texts should be understood as theological rather than strictly historical narratives, intended to emphasize God's sovereignty and the fulfillment of divine promises rather than to prescribe human conduct. Additionally, some theologians view these passages as hyperbolic, employing exaggerated language common in ancient military literature to emphasize total victory rather than literal destruction. However, for many modern readers, the ethical implications of these narratives remain deeply troubling, prompting ongoing reflection on how such texts should be interpreted in light of broader biblical themes of love, mercy, and justice. Another significant ethical challenge in the Old Testament is the status and treatment of women and marginalized groups within its laws and narratives. Many passages reflect the patriarchal structure of ancient Israelite society, in which women had limited legal rights and were often subject to male authority. For instance, laws regarding marriage, divorce, and inheritance, Deuteronomy 22, Numbers 27, illustrate a system in which women's autonomy was constrained, with their status largely defined in relation to male relatives. Additionally, episodes such as the treatment of Hagar, Genesis 16:21, the Levite's concubine, Judges 19, and Tamar, 2 Samuel 13, highlight instances of gender-based violence that raise moral concerns for contemporary readers. The institution of slavery, which is regulated rather than condemned in Old Testament law, Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, further complicates ethical discussions, as these laws permitted the ownership of individuals, including fellow Israelites and foreigners. Some argue that these regulations were intended to provide structure and protection within the realities of the ancient world, while others find it difficult to reconcile them with modern principles of human rights and dignity. Despite these challenges, many scholars and theologians highlight the seeds of ethical progress in these texts, pointing to laws that offered protections for the vulnerable and narratives that depict acts of courage and resistance by women, such as Deborah, Judges 4-5, and Ruth. A further ethical challenge in the Old Testament is the tension between divine justice and mercy, particularly in stories where God's actions appear severe or disproportionate by modern standards. The account of the flood, Genesis 6-9, describes God's decision to wipe out nearly all of humanity due to widespread wickedness, raising questions about collective punishment and divine wrath. Similarly, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19, and the plagues inflicted upon Egypt, Exodus 7-12, depict catastrophic divine judgments that provoke debates about proportionality and the suffering of the innocent. The story of Job adds another layer to these ethical concerns, as it presents a righteous man who endures extreme suffering as part of a divine test, leading readers to grapple with the nature of divine justice and the problem of human suffering. These narratives challenge believers to reflect on the limitations of human understanding when it comes to divine purposes and the broader theological themes of justice, repentance, and redemption. Despite the ethical difficulties posed by these texts, many interpreters find profound moral and theological insights within the Old Testament. Some argue that these narratives must be understood within their historical and cultural contexts, recognizing that the moral vision of the Bible unfolds progressively rather than being fully realized in its earliest writings. Others emphasize the broader biblical themes of justice, compassion, and covenant faithfulness that emerge from these stories, seeing them as part of an evolving moral framework that culminates in the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. Furthermore, ethical principles such as care for the poor, the pursuit of justice, and the protection of the vulnerable, prominent in Old Testament laws and prophetic literature, continue to inspire moral reflection and action today. Ultimately, the ethical challenges found in Old Testament narratives require careful interpretation, historical awareness, and theological reflection. While these texts may present difficulties for modern readers, they also invite deeper engagement with fundamental questions of morality, justice, and the nature of God. Through rigorous study and thoughtful dialogue, scholars, theologians, and believers alike continue to wrestle with these complex issues, seeking to understand how these ancient stories can inform contemporary ethical thought and spiritual growth.